Hey guys, I'm Gordon, this is Sydney. We're doing our topic on vegetarianism and Buddhism. So throughout this presentation, we're going to discuss the intersection of vegetarianism and Buddhism. And we want you to consider your dietary choices and consciously reflect on the factors that drive your consumption of meat. We're not necessarily trying to convert you to vegetarianism or anything like that. We merely hope that by the end of our presentation, you're encouraged to be more mindful and compassionate when deciding what to eat, regardless of whether or not you choose to consume animal products. A main aspect of Buddhism is awareness, and so we want to kind of pass it on to you guys.
There are three main arguments against eating meat. The first one would be the benefit for your personal well-being. The second one would be the well-being of all animals, and the third being the well-being of the environment. Buddhism tends to focus on the second one of these, which is the well-being of animals.
So what does Buddhism have to say about vegetarianism? A lot of Buddhist beliefs directly correspond to vegetarianism and the absence of meat within your diet. One of these main beliefs is the belief that all sentient beings are your mother and have been your mother in a previous life. As Geshe Lundab Sopa says in his commentary on the Lamrim, if you have a strong understanding of how all sentient beings have and will be your mother, every time you see another living creature you will feel, this is one of my mothers. Your attitude towards them will be similar to your love for your present mother. Another core belief within Buddhism is the notion of karma. Karma refers to the spiritual practice of cause and effect, where intent and actions of an individual influence the future of that individual. Buddhists believe that killing and harming other sentient beings results in bad karma, and this bad karma will manifest itself and ripen in your current life or your next life. Another core belief is ahimsa, or the Sanskrit word for nonviolence. Buddhist practitioners believe in compassion and nonviolence toward all sentient beings. One way this is manifested is through the practice of releasing life, or Caesar Sang. This is when animals that are about to be slaughtered for consumption or for other byproduct use are released and cared for by Buddhists. So can't some of these beliefs be seen as hypocritical? For example, if Buddhists believe that killing and suffering is wrong, then isn't killing vegetables wrong too? Yes, to some extent this is wrong. However, plant life is not sentient life. Plants are not with reason or emotion. If Buddhists want to avoid suffering and practice compassion, then isn't growing vegetables also wrong because it kills many insects? Not necessarily if we choose organic food, which is grown without the use of pesticides. Also, many insects are not considered to be sentient. So how are some of these Buddhist beliefs applicable? Some of these beliefs, especially the belief that all sentient beings are your mother or have been your mother in a previous life, may be difficult to wrap our mind around. And it may be difficult to see ourselves realistically believing this, especially because in some cases some people never knew their mother. In some cases someone's mother was abusive, so I think people may interpret this a little bit more literally than it's supposed to do. And we need to remember that the main point of this belief is to remember your mother's kindness and to encourage compassion toward all sentient beings. The last Buddhist belief we talked about briefly was karma. And karma might not necessarily be as applicable to Westerners because it's just something we don't really think about too often. We don't have the same belief system as Buddhists, but although this is true, we do believe in a system of cause and effect to some extent. So it might be easier for Westerners, especially in our context, to believe that eating meat can have negative effects. Not necessarily within our own personal life or our next life or the life that comes after that, but within the context of the environment. It might be easier for people to see that the consumption of meat can lead to environmental consequences such as global warming, or people can just see that eating meat or an excess of meat can have a negative consequence on their health or something like that. The core Buddhist belief of compassion is inherently more practical and applicable to our daily lives. It's something that all humans inherently understand, just being nice to one another and being nice to sentient beings that we interact with in our day-to-day lives. And it's just something we can easily wrap our mind around, and it's one reason why many people, including Westerners, choose to become vegetarian. Although it's tricky because some forms of compassion, such as Caesar Sang, which is the Tibetan practice of releasing life, might not be as useful. And this is something we'll discuss a little bit later, but diverted animals will just be replaced due to supply and demand. So it's not necessarily a sustainable solution because vegetarianism in this context is more individualized when it's dealing with larger problems such as animal cruelty. So can we see ourselves personally applying these Buddhist principles? So like I was saying earlier, it might be a little bit more difficult to kind of wrap our mind around these Buddhist philosophies and also to apply them directly to our own personal lives. And one instance of that is the belief that sentient beings are or have been our mother in a previous life. And I know for me that like I personally love my mother to no end, but it's also very hard for me to kind of conceptualize that and believe truly that all sentient beings are my mother. I realize that that's really just a practice to kind of encourage compassion, but it doesn't really um, fit as well with me. It's also a bit difficult for me to completely wrap my mind around the idea of karma in the context of vegetarianism. And while I do believe in karma to some extent, and cause and effect, it's not nearly to the same extent that Buddhists do, who practice Buddhism and also vegetarianism. I think that all of our actions do have a opposite and equal reaction, and some of the choices we make can influence our individual happiness and actions later in life. But it's hard for me to kind of see how the choice of eating or not eating meat can kind of directly contribute to that. I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I believe that the most practical and applicable Buddhist belief in the context of vegetarianism is the belief of nonviolence and compassion. And this is something I can see myself practicing actively in my daily life, and it's one of the main reasons why I initially became a vegetarian and eventually a vegan. I strongly support the environment, and that's one of the main reasons I chose to abstain from eating meat. But also, it's very clear to see the sentience in living beings that are commonly consumed for meat, such as like poultry and beef. You can see it in their eyes that they adequately express emotion and feelings. They feel pain just like any other being, and it's hard to knowingly eat meat knowing that you're directly leading to their suffering. And that's one of the things that initially allowed me to make the decision to abstain from meat. And this form of compassion aligns directly with what we learned in class about Buddhist philosophy. So how can we use compassion to be more mindful in our everyday lives?
As we just mentioned, the most applicable and probably most motivating factor to consider when deciding whether or not to eat meat is compassion. Compassion can, of course, be practiced by abstaining from meat, but it's most important to remain aware about the suffering that went into the production of the meat that you're eating. Once you realize that, it's easier to see the different suffering unfolding in your life. I inflict suffering on countless beings by proxy in my daily life, and while I can't alleviate all these sufferings, I can strive only to be mindful over my actions. Abstaining from eating meat, a blatant cause of suffering, was a way to be mindful in my personal life.
So does vegetarianism, specifically in a Buddhist context, make a meaningful difference? Vegetarianism in this context is an individualized response to a larger issue, which makes sense. Buddhism is a personal, introspective religion, and vegetarianism encourages you to reflect on where your meat comes from and why you choose to eat the way you do. And although it makes sense to frame vegetarianism in a Buddhist context in this way, it might not be the best vehicle to combat complex issues such as animal cruelty, environmental degradation, etc. So is it possible to be a good Buddhist while still eating meat? The answer to this question is yes, of course you can. One who eats meat can cultivate a pure heart, just as one who is vegetarian might have an impure heart. But why not cultivate a pure heart while making the extra effort to further practice the perfection of compassion by being a vegetarian? All true practitioners of the Mahayana path eventually relinquish meat eating, and this is largely because all practicing bodhisattvas cannot bear the pain of all sentient beings. Regardless of whether or not you eat meat, it is absolutely essential to understand where your food comes from and to realize that every choice we make, even if it's just deciding what to have for lunch, can have significant karmic consequences. So, now that we've come to the end of our presentation, we'd like you to reflect back to the beginning and consider some of your own personal dietary choices. A core aspect of Buddhism, and specifically within the context of vegetarianism, is awareness and mindfulness. So our first question is, how can you, personally, be more mindful when eating or purchasing food? Do you think the application of Buddhist philosophy strengthens or weakens the arguments behind vegetarianism? And lastly, what are some barriers that prevent you from being vegetarian? Alright, that's it. Thank you.